Hi folks, so Higher Truth Channel has this video out on August 1st claiming that Planet X has perturbed the orbit of Mars and has pulled it off the ecliptic, and it's now way too far below the ecliptic based on its position relative to the Moon, and we're going to address that. But he starts off the video actually complaining about the proposed orbit of Planet 9, a planet far beyond Neptune, which appears to be constraining the orbits of extreme trans-Neptunian objects. And this planet is still hypothetical, but it's proposed as an explanation for why the arguments of perihelion, basically the perihelion points of these planets, appear to be clustering in a way that you wouldn't expect. You would expect a random distribution as you discover these objects, but what we've found so far is they seem to be clustering, suggesting that something is out there constraining them. Now, Higher Truth Channel doesn't seem to understand why it looks like this. He thinks that astronomers just randomly drew this orbit, but in truth, the study was done to find the orbit that would explain why these objects appear to be clustering like this. What kind of object would it take to do that, and what kind of orbit would it have in order to explain this clustering effect? And it ends up that you have the proposed planet 9 in an orbit which is basically turned around in terms of the aphelion and perihelion points, turned around from the objects that it is constraining. And that is exactly what you should expect. Now, Higher Truth Channel doesn't seem to understand astronomy all that well, and he's basing his complaint based on his own personal expectations. Well, that's irrational and illogical. You need to do the research and find out for yourself. Do the research, look into the physics of it, and see what the Kozai mechanism is, and learn about it, and see for yourself. You can actually do integrations of the solar system using a program like ORSA to see how the gravity of the planets perturb each other and introduce new objects as well. Now, I did an integration recently with a minimum mass brown dwarf 13 times the mass of Jupiter, passing through the inner solar system at regular intervals of 3,600 years. What you find in this case is that very quickly the known major planets themselves become severely perturbed and end up in highly elongated orbits. Some of them are ejected from the solar system altogether, and the ones that are left end up in these orbits that are basically turned around 180 degrees from Nibiru's orbit, the object which is constraining them. So Nibiru's orbit is hanging out by itself down here, and the planets have orbits that are now highly elliptical and turned around the other way, just like what we're seeing with extreme trans-Neptunian objects in the real solar system. So that suggests there could be something out there causing that clustering. But if so, its orbit would be basically facing the other way. And Higher Truth Channel just doesn't understand this. And he's basically using that as the basis for his complaint that it's fake or that the astronomers are lying. I'm sorry, they're not. And you can do this test yourself using ORSA. So moving along, there are many other things that he says in this video that indicates that he doesn't really understand astronomy or even basic geometry all that well. So for example, he complains about Mercury's orbit being inclined to the ecliptic by 7 degrees. Well, that's not a new development. You can look back at the 19th century and Simon Newcomb's Tables of the Sun and the Inner Planets, and you're going to find out that Mercury's orbit was inclined to the ecliptic by 7 degrees back then, too. That hasn't changed. But what he says is that Mercury's orbit is changing based on this sky chart showing what SOHO will be seeing as planets transit through its camera. Now, SOHO is positioned pretty much directly between the Earth and the Sun at the Lagrange point. And you can see that on one transit, Mercury passes up here. He complains that suddenly this changes to a different position in the camera as it transits down here. So he's trying to suggest that something's perturbing Mercury's orbit to cause that. It's really just basic geometry, though. Yes, Mercury's orbit is inclined to the ecliptic by 7 degrees, but that doesn't mean it's always going to pass through the same way in the camera each time. And this is not the first time I've seen this guy make this mistake, and I've done videos addressing him before, back when he was under a different name on his channel. I think it was B Pierce 2. Anyway, as he uh, as he says now and as he said back then, he seems to think that that the planets should be passing through the camera in very consistent ways, always passing through at the same point. But that's not the case at all. Mercury's orbit being inclined to the ecliptic by 7 degrees doesn't mean that it's always 7 degrees above or below the ecliptic, of course. It has ascending and descending nodes, points at which it actually crosses the ecliptic plane as it orbits the sun. And if it so happens that it's crossing the ecliptic plane as it's transiting in front of the sun, you get a Mercury transit, just like we had earlier this year. And you can actually see that line passing right through the sun here. Now, it could be below the sun, it could be above the sun, it could be slightly less above the sun. It just depends on where it is in its orbit relative to those nodes, which in turn is, of course, also dependent on where SOHO is in its orbit around the sun. You're looking at a different portion of Mercury's orbit each time as SOHO orbits around the sun. That's how this works. It's just basic geometry, but it gets worse. So he also complains about Mars's position relative to the moon. He seems to think, I guess, that Mars orbits on the ecliptic, which it doesn't. Its orbit is also inclined to the ecliptic, but perhaps more importantly, he seems to have a basic misunderstanding about how far Mars itself can appear relative to the ecliptic. So in a previous video, in fact, in his last video, he showed a sky chart from Sky and Telescope from showing the position of the Moon and Mars on the evening of July 14th, 2016. And he said that Mars was way too far from the Moon, just like he says about these images. Well, here's July 14th, 2016. It's actually July 14th by local time, July 15th by universal time. 1 a.m. universal time is still July 14th here on the East Coast in the United States. And if we look at the separation of Mars and the Moon in Starry Night Pro, we see that Starry Night Pro predicts that they should have been about 7 degrees apart. Now, now Higher Truth Channel suggests that that's too much. That can't happen, or that shouldn't happen, given Mars's much lower inclination relative to the ecliptic than Mercury. And indeed, Mars is only about 1.8 degrees inclined to the ecliptic. And yet, here's the ecliptic line right here in the middle. So the Moon is actually above the ecliptic here, and Mars is a bit below it. But even if you just measure the distance to the ecliptic, we see that the angular separation there is about 2.5 degrees. So on this date, Mars is about 2.5 degrees below the ecliptic. But wait, I just said it's only about 1.8 degrees inclined to the ecliptic. Now, with Higher Truth Channel's logic, that would indicate that something has changed, that Starry Night Pro is trying to cover this up and make it seem like it's normal, but it's really not. Well, again, it's just basic geometry, and I will demonstrate that for you. So here's a simple, very simple view of the solar system, a chart I drew, taking a side view look along the plane of the ecliptic. The black line here represents the plane of the ecliptic bisecting the Earth and the Sun and extending out to the distance of Mars's orbit. Now, the circles, of course, are not to scale, but the distances are to scale in terms of the distance between the Sun, the Earth, Mars. So at this scale, the distance between Earth and the Sun, 1 astronomical unit, is 300 pixels. Now, if you do a little bit of math, you find out that Mars has a perihelion distance of 1.38 astronomical units. Here are the orbital elements for Mars at the date and time seen in the Sky and Telescope chart that he showed in his last video. And these are very simple calculations for Mars's apparent position at that time. It doesn't take into account the perturbations of the known planets on Mars. That does have an important impact. But for our purposes, we just want to see roughly how far Mars should be from the Moon at that time. And using this spreadsheet, which is based on my earlier moon calculations spreadsheet, and you can see the video about that. I'll include a link in the video description. You can see that at this time, Mars should be about 7 degrees from the Moon. Again, very simplified calculations here, just using the mean orbital elements of Mars, not accounting for the perturbations of the planets on Mars. But we can also calculate the perihelion distance of Mars. That's simply the semi-major axis times 1 minus the eccentricity of Mars, shown here. It's about 0.09. And if you do the math on that, you end up with a perihelion distance of about 1.38 astronomical units. So that's as close as Mars gets to the Sun, basically. And given a scale of 300 pixels per astronomical unit, that corresponds to a distance from the Sun of about 414 pixels. And given an inclination from the Sun inclination from the ecliptic of about 1.8 degrees, that corresponds to a distance from the ecliptic plane on our chart of about 13 pixels. So drawing that out here, you can see that in my chart, Mars has a distance from the Sun of about 414 pixels, and it's about 13 pixels from the ecliptic plane. And for an observer centered inside the Sun, looking from the center of the Sun out, if you could, you would see that Mars is about 1.8 degrees below the ecliptic at this scale. But the geometry of this changes when you're viewing from the position of Earth. So here's Earth at 1 astronomical unit. For the sake of argument, let's imagine that Earth and Mars are close together. Mars is at its perihelion, Earth is passing it. Taking a look at this, if we move the observer location here to the blue dot representing Earth, which again is 300 pixels from the center of the Sun in this diagram, so it's at 1260, and it should be at about 540 right here. So now we can see that from the position of an observer standing on Earth, Mars appears to be 6.5 degrees below the ecliptic plane in Earth's sky. So if you were looking as an observer on Earth in this situation, Mars would appear to be about 6.5 degrees below the ecliptic, much more than what Starry Night currently predicts. But that's sort of a maximum case. But you can see right now, on July 14th by Eastern Time, July 15th by Universal Time, it was only about 2.5 degrees, maybe close to 3 degrees from the ecliptic, and about 7 degrees from the moon. That's exactly what you should expect given the calculated position of Mars at that time. Its position relative to the ecliptic plane at that time was 2.8 degrees below by my calculations using the spreadsheet. Its position relative to the moon was about 7 degrees from the moon at that time. Again, matching up very nicely with what we're seeing in Starry Night Pro. So no, Starry Night Pro and other sky charts are not trying to cover up some change to Mars's orbit. That's exactly what you should expect given the geometry of the situation. I hope that clears things up for you guys. Clear skies, folks.